I'm Owen Anderson. I'm a professor of philosophy and religious studies, and I'm taking a look at a video where one atheist, Alex O'Connor, faces 25 Christians. Now, towards the end of that video, a member of the Church of Latter-day Saints is involved as one of the 25 Christians, but he distinguishes himself from Christians by saying he has a different view of God, and his view of God, he believes, is more rational. Let's see what Alex O'Connor thinks.
Because I represent a form of Christianity that a lot of people don't even consider as Christian. Huh? I'm a Latter-day Saint, also known as a Mormon. Awesome. And my claim is that the restored gospel, also known as Mormonism, provides a conception of God that is more rationally defensible than any other creedal Christian sect. Our theological claims, for example, the problem of evil, okay? So the way that we address it. So the problem really, so far as I can tell, that you have isn't so much with suffering, right? Because suffering could be something that is justifiable, right?
Yeah, in principle, it's sort of the amount of suffering, the depth of suffering.
Absolutely. So the issue really is injustice. It's
not injustice, it's suffering, and particularly suffering of non-human animals.
Okay, and fair enough. So with the concept of injustice,
Wait, Alex O'Connor just completely redirected it and said it's not injustice. It's suffering that's undeserved. So some kinds of suffering make sense. For example, if I run into a burning building and save a baby and I come out, the baby's saved, but I have burn marks, I'd say, well, it was worth it because I saved this baby. But the kinds of suffering that Alex O'Connor points to, which he believes shows that theism, God the Creator, who himself had no beginning, existed from eternity, that can't be true, Alex O'Connor says, with the kinds and amount of suffering. Now, the LDS church is not theistic. They believe God had a beginning. Or, alternatively, they might say, well, the intelligence that became God had no beginning, but really all intelligences have no beginning. So either God had a beginning or none of us had a beginning. Either way, that's not the same as Christian theism.
Conception of God is that God actually, his purpose is to make us become as he is.
Yes, does that include animals as well?
Animals.
Now it's interesting, just to pause for a minute, because remember in Genesis 3, that's a very similar phrase to what the serpent said to Eve. You will become as God if you eat of this fruit. So this promise of what is called deification is an important part of the LDS teaching, that God himself was once a man like us. He went through a trial, passed, and became God, and now we will do the same thing. We will become gods. So again, very different than what theism in Christianity teaches, which is that God has had no beginning. He didn't become God. He's not finite and changeable like us, but he created everything else.
Part of the created order that will be redeemed along with the rest of the created order.
Okay, so what does suffering do for them?
Suffering is part of the inherent nature of the world as a fallen world.
All right, so this is interesting because he says inherent part of the world, and then he adds fallen world. But I think if you look into it, he'll say that material stuff, because of limitations, is what causes suffering, versus saying, no, the world was made very good. You could have a material existence with no suffering. Let's see how he develops it.
Even for animals?
Yes, even for animals.
Whose fault is that?
Let me break it down.
A lot of questions.
Yeah,
and that again, that's Alex O'Connor's big thing. He's picking that up from a philosopher named William Rowe, who had a famous article in the, well, it must be late 70s, early 80s, about a fawn who was badly burned in a forest fire and lay there suffering and then died. And he says that kind of suffering is not consistent with God's existence. So I don't know if Alex O'Connor knows that's where he picked it up, but that's been kind of the dialogue among these sorts of atheists for a number of decades.
So if I have a child and I want my child to grow up to become like me, my child needs to go out of my house. He needs to go into the lone and dreary. And if that is the case, that means that there's going to be some level of separation between me and him. He's in the world of injustice. It's a world that is unfair.
Why is that world unjust and unfair? Because I understand what you're saying. You're in this analogy, You want your child to become like you. And what that's going to involve is encountering suffering, developing as a person, getting thicker skin. But the only reason that you want that for your child is because they're going to live in a world where they're going to have to encounter that, and you want them to be better at dealing with that, right? If you were given the opportunity to give your child a life that was separate from you, where they went about and did their business, but there wasn't that kind of suffering, and you chose the one in which there was suffering just for the sake of it, I think that would be problematic.
Well, it's not.
Yeah, so what Alice O'Connor's pointing out here is the circularity of the LDS soul-making view. And it's not limited to them. There's been other soul-making views. John Hick, the philosopher of religion, was made that popular again in the 1960s, soul-making. And that idea is that you need to suffer to learn virtues. But Alex points out, well, wait a minute. The virtues you need because the world has suffering in it. So you need to suffer to learn virtues because there's suffering. That's not an answer. Why not have no suffering? Let's see if he has a response to that.
Chose to put them in that world. See, this is a difference in Latter-day Saint theology.
That's what I mean.
Here we go.
In Latter-day Saint theology, there is a pre-existence.
Mm-hmm.
And human beings, knowing the unjust nature of reality, have the choice.
Oh, they choose to.
They choose to enter into the mortal state, to pass through. The way to look at it is there's this realm of injustice where anything can happen. I can go out tomorrow, my kid can get cancer, all these things can happen. And the idea is we say, but if you're willing to pass through the realm of injustice, this is a necessary condition to reach your divine potential.
Come, was it necessary?
But there's another thing about Latter-day Saints.
So this is interesting. So to become God, you have to go through this realm of injustice, which seems to exist. It does exist independent of God, because quote unquote God that they speak of was once like us. He went through the realm of injustice and became God. And so did his father and his father back. I think Brigham Young says it goes back to infinity. So this realm of injustice exists independent of these gods. And it is inherently a realm of suffering. Versus the view that no, God made the world, it was very good, and he created the world. The world was not inherently unjust. But the whole story is, you go through that realm, you chose it ahead of time to become God. Now, that's a very common story in the pagan world. That's not new to Joseph Smith. He picked that up from other influences in his life that he was reading. But this idea that you go through the world to become God is one of the standard stories in the pagan world. In contrast to that, stark contrast, is Genesis, which rejects that pagan view and says you don't become God. In fact, that's the original temptation. God is always God. You're always a creature. But you can become to know God. And that's our highest good. Not that we become God, which puts the focus on me. I want to be a God. But instead, the focus is always on God. What we get, the highest good we get, is to know him and be in a relationship with him for eternity. Now, let's see why he thinks this is a better solution.
It's different. Like, for instance, God cannot create a square circle.
Why does that apply here?
Because God cannot bring you to your divine potential because of the nature of the laws of reality.
Okay, but like, why not? Because you're just sort of restating that you can't do it. I want to know why.
Yeah, it's really important here that he makes a confusion between the laws of thought, non-contradiction, no square circles, and the laws of reality, which can be different. For example, the Red Sea can be parted by God, which is contrary to the laws of gravity and the natural order of things. But God can overrule those things. The laws of thought are different. They apply to being. They're part of the being of God. And so God doesn't act against his being. So here he's trying to slip in and say this is reasonable, but he's confusing reason and the laws of nature. But it's worth pointing out that evangelicals have relied on a really similar story for a few decades, that evil is due to free will, and free will is necessary for a loving relationship. And so God sort of just creates you, stands back and wrings his hands, hoping that you choose him so you have a loving relationship. And so it's not surprising that this also percolates up into other adjacent views like the LDS Church. But the Reformed view, and really you'll find it in the Catholic view, whether it's Calvin, Aquinas, Augustine, or Paul, or Moses, is that God is sovereign, and he sovereignly rules the world, even over free will. You can have free will, meaning you get to do what you want. but it doesn't mean you're uncaused. God made you. So let's see if he's able to get out of this problem. I think Alex O'Connor's caught him.
Thing is that there are laws that even God is bound.
Like which laws are relevant here? Like which laws is
like the law of non-contradiction, for instance.
Why is explain to me how the law of non-contradiction binds God to not create a world where there's no suffering?
Because that relationship with God must be freely chosen.
See, there it is.
God cannot force, because there is the question, why doesn't God just make us all
Okay, but that's a separate question, because God could make a world in which there's no suffering, which you're still
I disagree.
in which you're still free
He can't.
to choose whether or not to follow him.
Because I disagree, but in Genesis, God did. The world had no suffering until after sin.
I would say that that is a logical contradiction.
Okay, so
Whoa.
can you tell me why?
And he says it's a logical contradiction. That's a big deal. In other words, the LDS Church corrects the Bible. It says their book is more accurate than the Bible. And so apparently on this point, Genesis chapter 1, the Bible's wrong.
What you're telling me is that it's illogical on the level of creating a square circle to create a system that a person can voluntarily choose to sort of exit the heavenly realm and go into in order to do whatever they need to do to get to God's ultimate
Not to
potential.
get to God, to become as he is.
Sure, to fulfill that.
And it's really good that he's emphasizing that phrasing, because it's literally what the serpent said to Eve. Now, I've heard, unfortunately, some Christians echo this and say that, well, that was always the goal. It's just that the serpent wanted to help Adam and Eve get there sooner, his own way, rather than going God's way. But they especially quote from Genesis 3 after the fall, when God says that he has to keep them from the tree in case they eat it. And he says they become like one of us. So they'll say, see, he was always supposed to become a god, and God confirms it. But what does it mean, like one of us there? When the serpent says this, you'll know good and evil the way God does. You'll be as God, knowing good and evil. What that means is God knows good and evil as the creator, not as a creature. We discover it by using our minds to figure things out. God knows good and evil because he created it that way. He made things with natures, and what's according to the nature of a thing is what's good for it. So we can never know good and evil as God knows good and evil, not to mention that he knows it infinitely, exhaustively, which we'll never do. But on the other part, the other side of the fall, when God says they become like one of us, what they have done is they've put themselves in the place of God, and they've decided good and evil for themselves, even though they're incorrect. And it's based on the complete lie that they can be as God. They've done this. And so because of that, they're kept from the tree of life, because they are going to live underneath the curse of old age, sickness, and ultimately death. From dust you came, to dust you shall return.
Potential that has to involve not just suffering, but the kind of suffering that we see on planet Earth. Asking why that's logically necessary.
A totally unjust world.
Mhm.
Okay, because it is by passing through this realm that we have the experience of injustice that allows us to know what injustice is.
But why do we need to know what injustice is?
Because how else can you come to be like God? Kind of like the Adam and Eve story. There's the fruit of the tree of knowledge and good and evil.
So what is justice? How do you define justice?
Off the top of my head, I would say,
So seriously, he says something here. You won't know what justice is unless you experience injustice. And again, I've heard evangelicals say this as well, and it's simply incorrect. You can know about things by thinking about them. Justice and injustice are a logical pair, and you can define justice, and then you can define injustice. That's completely different than saying I've experienced either one, because you could experience it and not understand it. There's people that call what is actually injustice justice, and what is actually justice injustice. So the issue is not experiencing it. The issue is understanding the difference.
justice is getting what you deserve.
Yeah, right. Okay. And so the problem is that, like, you can imagine a situation in which there was nothing wrong, nothing bad, nothing evil, and therefore no need for this rectifying force of justice. It's a little. We say justice is a good thing, but justice is a good thing insofar. Hold on. Justice is a good thing insofar as it overcomes injustice. That's what it's there for. In the same way that chemotherapy is a good thing because it tries to overcome cancer. If I said that I was going to create cancer so that we could have the good of chemotherapy,
That's a circularity.
There's no way for us to achieve the good of chemotherapy without creating cancer. You look at me like I'd lost my mind.
No, it's like saying, this is the better.
Soul making.
It's like saying to my son, the only way that you can become the way I am is to go out into that world where anything could happen. and to persevere.
Okay, I still have one with, but for the sake of time, I want to ask you about animals. Do animals consent to go into this?
The animal kingdom is part of the fallen world. They are part of the fallen order.
Do they feel pain?
I don't know. That's more of a good question. I don't know necessarily where.
What's your confidence?
That is one of the ways that people sidestep the problem of evil for animals. I think it's mistaken, but they simply just reduce them to a machine and say, well, animals don't feel pain, so it doesn't matter. And unfortunately, I've seen even conservative Christians, they should be conservationist, conservative, but they're quite cruel to animals on this same idea that animals don't experience pain. But I think you wouldn't be able to read the Bible and see that God doesn't care about his creation. When God questions Job, God points him to creation and specific animals in creation that God takes joy in. And these animals are valuable because they're made by God, not because they experience pain. That's how the atheist tries to bring it up. Well, why do they have to experience pain because of us? But they're valuable because they're creations of God that reveal something about God. Now, the soul making just broke down completely. The analogy is a false analogy. I want my son to learn how to persevere because the world we currently live in has suffering. But if I could create a world with no suffering for my son, I would do that. Not only that, it's worse than that. Because it's as if a father puts Drano in the middle of the living room, the cap is off, and lets his toddler wander around and says, hey, the world contains things that will kill you in an instant. So I'm letting my son experience that by having the potential for drinking Drano right there. We would all say that's nuts. That's above anything you should ever train your child for. That's child abuse because the child has not yet developed a mind capable of making those kinds of long-term choices and knowing simple differences between Drano and something else that's not harmful. So humans are like that. God put us in this world, according to the LDS view, with serious amounts of suffering that we are only prepared for because we're in the world with serious amounts of suffering. If we didn't have that world, we wouldn't need to be prepared for it. And so Alex O'Connor's really got a good point here about that soul-making theodicy, whether we find it in the Mormon church or we find it somewhere else in the pagan world. But it is that same story that we become gods. The focus is on me, not on God, not on Christ, but on me. They are there to serve as examples for me to become a god, rather than my goal is to know the eternal God. And that's where his analogy breaks down, because I'm a finite father. I had a beginning. I think one thought after another. I'm limited. I have things I don't know and should know. And so I have to do the best I can with my child. God's infinite. He had no beginning. We had a beginning. And as a father, he can perfectly make us. So we still are free, but we make the right choices. So we need to explain why that wasn't the case. And this solution that the LDS member here spoke so highly of, this is the rational solution, really crumbled quite quickly from the atheist Alex O'Connor.
If I started strangling a dog in front of you, would you stop me?
Yeah, I think that I have an obligation to prevent the death of living creatures.
Not death. No, I'm not going to kill it. I'm going to
Well, even if
death style, keep it alive just so it can suffer.
Yeah,
Will you
sure.
stop me from doing that?
Yeah.
But why?
Because I believe that God wants us to protect the created order.
Okay, so
and to create goodness, light, and truth.
So would that be similar to, like, me stepping on a plant or something? You're just like, hey, don't do that, man. It's the creative.
No,
Or
you
do
can
you
say
think
that-
it's because they're suffering?
I think it is probably because they're suffering, but I don't understand that suffering in terms of the way that humans suffer.
Okay, because you said that the reason why it's not so much of a problem for humans to enter the Vale of Tears and have to suffer is because they consent to do so before they're born. If animals don't do that, then I don't think that their suffering is justified on the same grounds.
Well, let me turn this around, because while I
He's got him.
some objections there, my claim is that we have a better capacity to handle this than the creedal Christian model.
Sure. Okay. So
Would you agree with me?
No, it's really good that he does distinguish himself. It's not me or someone else saying LDS is not Christian. He's saying we are different than the creedal Christian model, going back to ecumenical creeds, coming down to the present. And so that means especially Roman Catholicism and the Reformed Church, Eastern Orthodoxy as well. But sometimes what you'll find as a LDS scholar looking to Eastern Orthodoxy's view of deification and saying we're the same as that is not. Deification in that context is more like what is called sanctification, being made holy, so that although you're always a creature, you have knowledge, holiness, and righteousness. Or they might find one guy. It's always the same guy, the theologian Origen. And anytime someone says, my view is the same as the patristics, and you say, oh, which patristic? Origen, okay, you know there's problems because he's on the outside, always coming up with these views, which really were pagan. They were coming out of Plato's pagan background, and Plato was just making a philosophical version of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. So that's why I said this view, pre-existing, going through the veil of tears, becoming a god, that's always been the pagan view. Moses, in writing Genesis, inspired by God, is rejecting that view and giving the alternative view, which is that God is eternal, God had no beginning, God is infinite and unchangeable. He created the world, which did have a beginning, including our souls, what they might call intelligences. We had a beginning. We didn't pre-exist, let alone exist from eternity. Do you know how to show that we had a beginning? That you didn't exist from eternity? You should be able to show that by reason and give a quick syllogism. If you go over to my YouTube channel, you'll see that I give arguments to show how to do that, how to show that something must be eternal, that God alone has existed from eternity, that the material world had a beginning, and that we, our souls, our intelligences, had a beginning. These are very simple parts, really 101, so to speak, introductory level parts for the philosophy of religion. Let's see how he wraps it up.
That we have a better model than creedal Christianity?
I don't know, because I don't know enough, because we've only been speaking for 10 minutes. There are probably things that it deals with better and things that it deals with worse. For example, I've spoken a ton on my show about the Gnostic cosmology, which I think does a lot to do away with problems like the problem of evil and the weird sort of seeming immateriality of Jesus in some passages and stuff. But there's a lot of problems with it too.
Yes, so the Gnostic view is probably more similar to LDS. They would say that there are two eternal things, matter and spirit. And so it does better because it generally says evil is located in matter, which is eternal. It doesn't do better at all because matter can't be eternal and evil can't be eternal. Augustine did a great job of showing why that view can't be true in his book, The Confessions.
Ton of problems, such as God's providence and nature of why the demiurge is created. All of these ideas are oftentimes, I think, created because they better account for certain things over others. I don't think that's necessarily the case with Mormonism, of course. But yeah, I'm sure in some cases it does better, in some cases it does worse. In this case, I don't think it does anything more to explain the suffering of animals.
Your problem with the suffering of animals is that it's unjust.
No, it's not.
Then why do you? What suffering? If suffering ultimately is redeemed, let's say the animals on the other side, for all they suffer, they get the best possible animal future that you could ever imagine, and the animals get there and they go, "This is great. It was all worth it."
Yeah, then
it would be worth it. So it's the injustice of it.
The question is, why aren't they just given that without the suffering first?
Well, I was going to say,
I can understand why with humans, for whatever. Again, I want to clarify. I still have qualms with your idea, but let me just grant it for a moment. I can understand why you need to do that with humans before they get the nice reward at the end. But why the animals? Why cause them to suffer?
Human beings will suffer as well, unjustly. It's just the nature of an unjust world.
The suffering of animals, I think, is unexpected if a good God is overseeing.
But it's not a problem if ultimately they are compensated.
Well, I think it still is a problem. But if you had the opportunity to not have that dog need the shot, and you gave them the shot anyway, you created the need for the shot, and then gave them the shot.
Yeah, that's the circularity.
Cosmology, God doesn't. God does not create the conditions that are where the shot is necessary.
There it is.
You're correct. And you're correct on creedal Christianity. It does, and that's the biggest flaw with it. By the way, I want to give you that's. Oh, hey,
thanks,
Alex. It's been great to meet, man.
That's a key. And he admitted there, Alex Sod. God is not the creator. He is the former. Alex used the word demiurge from Gnosticism, and that's really where the LDS Church, through Joseph Smith and his connections with things like Masonic thought, is getting this idea. Not from the scriptures, not from the Bible, but from this stream of paganism, which says God does the best he can. He forms the world, but he doesn't create it. He's not sovereign over the conditions of the world. Now, the problem there is it leaves us still with this question, well, what is eternal? What has existed from eternity? Not God, in the Mormon view, small g. There, the word God is a title. I became God, like I became a professor. I wasn't eternally a professor. The intelligences, well, if the intelligences have existed from eternity, they should already know everything. They shouldn't have to go through the veil of suffering to know more. They've existed from eternity, so they can't be eternal if they're ignorant. So the material stuff, I guess, of the world has existed from eternity. And that's why some people say the LDS Church is a materialist philosophy. They'll speak about the intelligences as refined matter. So there's still material, but it's really refined. Like air maybe is more refined than solid stuff. and intelligence are even more refined, but it's still a materialist philosophy, which again is another big difference with historic Judaism and Christianity in what he calls creedal, but we could also just call it scriptural. Because what happens is when the LDS Church's book, the Book of Mormon, is in conflict with the Bible, they say the Bible's wrong. So it's not as if they say the Bible is infallible and we agree with it. They say, no, it's mistaken on these points that disagree with this pagan notion about how you become a deity. So it's interesting. He started off with a high claim. I'm going to use reason to show that this view is far superior to theism of the Bible. And it was just the pagan soul-making theodicy, which Alex O'Connor pointed out has this essential circular reasoning, and I'm pointing out has these essential metaphysical flaws. We still need to know what's eternal. And he confesses himself that his God, small g, isn't eternal. So what is eternal? Join me. I'm over on Patreon as Dr. Owen Anderson, where I do philosophical mentoring on this kind of thing, or I have a number of videos on YouTube where we also address that question, what has existed from eternity and how can I know?